Hey, that's pretty good.
せーのでもそんなんじゃダメもうそんなんじゃ心は進化するよもっともっとそんなんじゃダメもうそんなんじゃほら心は進化するよもっともっと
No! God, please, no! 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 No!
Alright guys, so join me by the bonfire and let's take a look at the details for this one-hand overkill build that I've been messing around with for DEATHBLOW. First, let's take a look at our skills and then we can take a look at our items and Paragon board. So first up, our basic is Flay. The reason we took that is just for some damage reduction because we are a walking arsenal build, meaning we need to use 3 different weapon types for the maximum bonus of additional 15% times damage. So because our DEATHBLOW is one hand and Frenzy uses one hands only, you can't really go with this. So that's why we chose Flay for some extra damage reduction. If you are not pushing and doing higher tier content, you could go for Lunging Strike, which just a nice movement benefit, quality of life, as well as additional berserking when it crits. And we're going to be critting a lot with our Paragon board once we take a look at that in a second. Next up, we have Upheaval. The reason we took Upheaval here is just for mainly the 20% chance to stun enemies. Our build do revolve around doing extra damage to stunned enemies. Your skills using bludgeoning effects deal 15 times more damage if the enemy is stunned or vulnerable, which is great. We're going to have actually constant vulnerability, so the stun is actually just a nice extra bonus here. So that's kind of why we went for that. Next up is our Shout. Of course, this is pretty standard for barbarians, unfortunately. It's just too powerful right now not to give up. Rallying Cry gives you movement speed, which is whatever. Resource, which is kind of nice. But the main reason you want to grab this is you want to be unstoppable. It's our only source of unstoppable, and the only time that you would die is if you get hit by CC and you are stunned and can't use potions. Other option to get unstoppable is Iron Skin, but that requires a defensive aspect. This is basically just like an extra point versus sacrificing in aspect 4. But because we are walking arsenal, we're kind of stuck to using at least minimum 3 different abilities that require different weapons. Next up, I have a lot of points in Challenging Shout. It just gives you a crap ton of damage reduction, 62% when it's maxed out. The reason we don't want to get the next bonuses is because when you gain 20% bonus maximum life, you actually automatically take off any Fortify. This essentially just pretty much takes off your Fortify, so you don't really want that if you are pushing. And the extra Fury gain is like nice, but not really needed for this build. Next up is Warcry. Warcry is nice because you do get 15% more damage for 7.5 seconds. You also get Berserking, which is great. However, for our build, we actually have a ton of ways to generate Berserking, so it's not super needed, but it's just nice. For example, Upheaval damages at least 2 enemies. You gain Berserking for 2 seconds, increase to 3 seconds if it damages at least 4 enemies. So if you like right-click into a pack, you're almost guaranteed to get 3 seconds of Berserking right here, as well as DEATHBLOW on its own. If it damages at least 1 enemy, you gain Berserking for 3 seconds. So you're Berserking all the time. You don't really need this, but you could take these 2 points off if you feel like it. But the last bonus is actually pretty nice. It's just more Fortify generation. For barbarians, pretty much the way to stay alive is Fortify. So and you get a lot of damage reduction through Fortify in your tree here, 6%, as well as in your Paragon board, as well as in your gear where you have the blue gems, damage reduction while fortified, 3% per gem. Fortify is always great. If you are not pushing for higher tier content, you could opt for getting 10% more multiplicative damage. So it's not additive. It's great. That's also nice. So this turns into 25% more damage instead of just 15. So depends on what you do, giving you some options here. If you are wanting to speed farm with this build, you can definitely take out some of the defensives, like all these points into challenge shout, into just more straight up damage. Next up, this is actually pretty good for our build. Something I might consider taking out some damage to get more damage reduction, because you gain 3% damage reduction while berserking. And like I just showed you, we are berserking constantly, right? So that's pretty good. 3% there. And you can get another 6% if I max this out. I also maxed out this for berserking fury generation, increased by 18%. Honestly, I might see how it feels if I take out the fury generation and put it into the damage reduction. Yeah, play around with that, see how it feels. If you're managing to generate enough fury to sustain your upheavals, then, you know, start taking out fury generation, because you might not need it and you can put it into defense and offense. Here's the moneymaker, Deathblow. Everything centers around this ability. Basically, through our items and our skill tree here, we have 12 points in here, which is kind of nuts. 252% damage to enemies in front of you, right? And if it kills the enemy, it resets its cooldown. You'll notice the cooldown is quite long. It's 13 seconds. There's some items that I can upgrade to decrease this a bit further, but it is pretty long. And the worst thing about this build is if your death blow doesn't kill anything and it's suddenly on cooldown. To mitigate that, we do have an item aspect that I'll show you now, but basically your weapon mastery has an additional charge. So this is for death blow and all weapon mastery. The next part doesn't really matter, but hey, we are, like I mentioned at the start, we are trying to stun as often as possible. So we have damaging enemy with a weapon master skill has up to 48% chance to stun them for 2 seconds. Nice little bonus to stunning enemies, which in turn increases our damage to them. Next up, Deathblow deals 100% increased damage to bosses. It's pretty nice if you are doing a dungeon with some sort of boss. It is not great for Uber Lilith because, you know, you're not killing things fast enough to keep resetting death blows. So it's not a meta build in that sense. This is more of a build that if you want to either speed farm with or just switch it up to have some fun, because it is very satisfying to play. As you can see in the video earlier, cleared a tier 60 perfectly fine. So first up are offensive passives at the top. It's pretty straightforward. You take Pit Fighter for 9% increased damage to close enemy, and you get some damage reduction from distant, which is great. You also have increased critical strike chance against immobilized, stun, or slowed enemies. Because we are stunning quite often, it's nice to have the 9% critical strike here. Could put it into probably Slaying Strike, which you deal 8% increased damage against injured enemies. So injured, I believe, is under 35% health. When the enemies are below that, you can get 15, right? So that's another 7% and another 7%. It's quite nice, honestly. The reason we took the crit here for now, I was just playing around with it, but leave it up to you. You could choose either one. And then the next one, it is pretty important. Dealing direct damage with a weapon mastery skill causes your next core skill to make enemies vulnerable for 3 seconds. So that's 100% chance, right? So when you death blow and then you right click with upheaval, which is an AoE, shoots in front of you, everything in that range is vulnerable. Rather than the typical version you would get is lucky hit, your core skill has up to 10% chance to make enemies vulnerable for 2 seconds. Again, this is lucky hit. So lucky hit is pretty RNG based, right? Many times this just won't proc. For death blow, it's pretty nice synergy between the two abilities, just guaranteeing vulnerable. Next up, we just took 1 point for thick skin, just basically to unlock the next 2 tier, which is while you're fortified, you're getting 6% damage reduction. And then next up, when you are fortified for over 50% of your maximum life, you deal 12% more damage. I mean, that just straight up 12% more damage is great because you are constantly fortified. We love that. Next up, We basically just take some passives here, which is actually great. Your skills using bludgeoning weapons deal 15% increased damage if the enemy is stunned or vulnerable. Now they're constantly vulnerable and they're likely always stunned, so 15% more damage, that's great. But because of this, you want to make sure your Deathblow is a weapon that has a bludgeoning weapon, right? As long as you have one bludgeoning weapon in there, then it would get this bonus. Final passive here is another lucky hit. We already went over this. Is basically just to get more stun. Deathblow actually has an insanely high 56% lucky hit chance. Finally, the last point that we're going to grab is our keystone. We are trying to actually maximize Deathblow damage, right? So Deathblow is not core. So there's only 3 options outside that. Bleeding, which we are not a bleed build, and the berserk duration, which is not that great because we're constantly berserking, and as you can see, it's only plus 25% damage versus times 25% damage. So obviously we take this one in that case. That pretty much is the skill tree. So like I said, there are some options depending on what you want to do with this build, the type of content that you want to do. You can take out some defenses and put them into more offensive stats, or vice versa. Now let's take a look at our items. Our aspect, each point of fury generated at maximum fury grants 36 fortify. You could go for another aspect where, not exactly this one, but it's when you lucky hit, you gain fortify. That's pretty much it. So you could try that one as well, because lucky hit on Deathblow is insane. That's one alternative. Might play around with that, but this is working fine. Stats, obviously, you want plus 3 ranks to Deathblow. Once you upgrade it to max, it should hit level 4 like this, which is quite nuts. Since this is Deathblow build, we're just trying to push this as high as possible. As you can see, we got it up to 252%. After that, what you want, cooldown reduction, is pretty much as equally important as Deathblow ranks almost, because you want to lower this as much as possible. You do not want to be standing around waiting for this to be off cooldown. So cooldown reduction is really important. Life on your helm at least is just pretty great. You can see I have almost 14k life. If I swap these 2 red gems, I have well over, I think, almost 16k life. So that helps stopping you from getting one shot. So it's just a nice little bonus. And then instead of strength, I would probably go for total armor. So right now we have 8600 armor. Reduces physical damage taken from enemies equal to your level by 77%. I believe the maximum is capped at 85. To mitigate that, we'll take a look at our next aspect. You gain 0.45. You can get it up to maximum of 0.5 increase armor when you deal any form of damage, stacking up to 50%. So maximum, you can get 50% armor. You can imagine 50% armor here. Boom. You're going to be a lot tankier. So one of the craziest aspects for defense for barbarians, basically Deathblow ranks, cooldown reduction, armor, and health. Probably armor over health. Next up, our chest. We just went over the aspects, so we can skip into our stats here. You want probably the 4 ranks of challenging shout. You get 62% damage reduction for almost 8 seconds, right? And we're decreasing the cooldown of this. It looks like it's 21 seconds, but it's actually not once everything comes into play. So 62% damage reduction. This is kind of the one ability that stops you from dying. And when you pop that, you are pretty much immortal. But when you don't have that, start dodging. So next up, I would, again, probably choose the armor. Armor is just crazy. Instead of life is great, but I think damage reduction is even better. Instead of life, I would get damage reduction while fortified, because you can get, I believe, almost like 20% or something like that, something crazy. And also damage reduction while closed, another like 20% or something. So I would replace my maximum life roll and my just this measly 8.6 damage reduction with the 2 I mentioned, which is close and fortify damage reduction. Glove is interesting. It's kind of a slot that you can put weapon, like offensive aspects, as well as some utilities ones. So up to you what you want to do here. But for me, I chose you have 20% increased crowd control duration. So when we stun, They're stunned longer, which is not bad because we're going to be doing more damage while they're stunned, right? While the enemies are unstoppable, because at some point the diminishing returns of stuns is going to kick in and they're just going to be unstoppable. Guess what? They take, well, you deal 50% more damage to them. That's pretty good. And then in terms of stats, I would definitely get maxed out critical strike chance. So ours is actually pretty low. You could get 12%, which is another 6 on top of what I have here. After that, probably the lucky hit chance for the stuns. Attack speed is one of those stats that is a bit tricky. So let's take a look at this. It is basically a build site similar to the one on max roll or D4 builds or whatever, but the great thing about this one is, as you can see, when you hover over certain spells, it'll say attack speed multiplier 1.25, right? So that's how you know attack speed actually affects that ability, whereas the other sites doesn't have this key information, which is kind of crazy. You can see on Upheaval it's 1.1, and then similar to Hoda it's 1.1, but certain ones that you'll see, for example, Whirlwind has nothing, no attack speed modifier. What does that mean? It is a channeling ability, and when you are increasing as much attack speed as you want, guess what? Whirlwind is not going to hit faster as well as Deathblow, right? No attack speed multiplier. Essentially, it doesn't increase any of our attack speed except for Upheaval, which is still nice, but you can get something else like damage to injured enemies as a stat you can get on club, which is pretty good for death blowing things. And then we have maximum ranks to upheavals. So it is just a nice to have because it's extra damage, right? And even though our death blow is our main thing, we are still going to be doing a little bit of damage with upheaval. Next up is our pants. So our pants here, our basic skill grants 20% damage reduction for 6 seconds. That's nice. You hit something once, you get 20% damage reduction, and it lasts for 6 seconds. So once 6 seconds is up, just remember to hit something again, and we're going to be hitting things. And because we are a weapon swapping build, we're just going to be hitting things constantly, so this is up all the time. As for stats, pants is very much your go-to slot for defensive stats. So you want damage reduction while fortified. So for example, right here, you can get almost 20%, which is crazy. So that's the most important stat. Next up is our damage reduction from close enemies, almost 23% if you got this maxed out, which is also amazing. Third stat, I would probably go for total armor. Total armor is pretty nuts. We have a max roll on that, which is great. And then finally, we can get even more damage reduction, for example, like damage reduction from distant enemies, but we have life here, which is still pretty great. Damage reduction from bleeding wouldn't be that great because our build pretty much doesn't use bleed except for flay. So next up is our boots. So this is kind of also another key aspect that you need. Your weapon mastery skill has additional charge. That's self-explanatory. You kind of really need this to get the build going. On these boots, this is very much a speed farming one. So I have just as high as movement speed as possible to zoom around, and then you get 33% movement speed after killing elite. Berserking duration, we're berserking all the time. You could swap that out for maybe strength even. And then all stats is great because you'll see Paragon levels are very much hungry for all stats. You really need high dexterity and willpower to get some of the later Paragon stuff. So boots is one of those that you can just get some stats that you need to flesh out the build. Instead of resource reduction cost, you don't really need that because you're not a core centric build. Your main damage is from death blows, so you don't really need that. It is a nice benefit to have to be able to spam more upheavals, but yeah, I went for the movement speed on these ones. Let's take a look at our amulet next. You want +3 ranks to weapon mastery, and then I have +3 ranks of all defensive abilities because you do get ranks on your challenging shout as well as ranks into your rallying cry. So it's pretty good, just more damage reduction. I also have percent armor here, which is a pretty good stat to get on an amulet. Makes you even tankier. And then instead of damage reduction, you would want cooldown reduction for sure. Defensively, you can get like damage reduction while fortified instead of maybe armor, but no matter what, you want cooldown reduction. And this goes back to having your death blow up as soon as possible, right? And then as for the aspect, I did Retribution, which is destined enemies has 8% chance to be stunned for 2 seconds when they hit you. That's not really that important. What it is important is you deal up to 60% increased damage to stun enemies. Like I said, you're stunning all the time. You're going to be doing a lot more damage to them. And then when they are not stunned and they're unstoppable, you're also going to be doing more damage to them. So no matter what's happening, they are likely taking more damage from you. So that's kind of why I took that. Some people have been wondering, does this work with everything that you stun, or is it only tied to the top part? Distant enemies have 8% chance to be stunned when they hit you. That is a separate thing. You don't have to worry about that. You do get the full percent damage benefit whenever you stun, right? It's not just when distant enemies get stunned through this aspect. So the next ones is pretty straightforward. You are using shouts. Shouts currently are just too good to give up. You sacrifice basically damage reduction, unstoppable, multiplicative damage. That's kind of why shouts is in the meta right now. The aspect you want is whenever you cast a shout skill, your cooldown is reduced by 1.9 seconds per enemy that is nearby, up to 6 seconds, right? And on these stats, I do have critical strike damage, which is great. Critical strike chance you want, right? You want a crit. Resource generation, again, this is something that you could play around with, that you probably, depending, you can maybe get away with getting vulnerability damage instead, right? Because that would be a big boost to your death blow damage. But again, you do want some sort of resource though, as we'll take a look at some aspects later on to explain why that is. And then as well as maximum furies. So the reason that you want to get this is our first unique. The first unique you want is this one-hand sword. You are a one-hand death blow build. Skills using this weapon deal 0.3% increased damage per point of fury you have, but you lose 2 fury every second. I don't really notice the fury loss at all. So right now we only actually have 174 points. You multiply that by 0.3, right? That's how much damage you're getting. And you can get even more fury. You can get fury on your helm if you're going offensive build instead of like life, for example. Just get more maximum fury there. And then on your ring here, I have maximum fury, but on my next one, I don't. So you could get even another, let's say 18 points here. They start adding up, right? So, and on your next ring, your shout generates 4 fury per second while active. Basically lets you use your upheaval more. The reason we want to do that is after spending 100 fury, your next weapon mastery skill deals 200% increased damage. So your death blow is doing 200% more damage after you spend 100 fury. That's why I feel like resource reduction, for example, on your boots or your amulet, you don't really want, because you want to actually spend 100 fury, right? Although resource generation is probably still nice because you get fortify as well as just being able to take advantage of Ramaladnis. It's so hard to pronounce that. I'm just going to call it Ramas from now on. It's all synergistic, and what you want is obviously high vulnerability damage, so we can get another 20% there if we had max roll. And then next up, you want crit, of course. And then after that, I would choose all stats because of our Paragon. You'll notice on weapons is a great way to get a ton of all stats. Finally, I would go for either close or strength. I was trying to roll for close, but you can probably get close to, judging by these numbers, another 60-70% close damage, right? And it multiplies with your other stuff. Like multiplies with your vulnerable and crit, of course. That's what I would go for, but strength is all right too, because strength, as you can see, gives your armor for more tankiness, as well as increases your skill damage. Next up is our second unique that we kind of need to get the build going, is Overkill. You do sacrifice some key stats that would be amazing to have it on two-hander, but the aspect I found is pretty necessary. Now, don't worry about rolling an insane high damage per second here, since like I said, we are a one-hand death blow build, so having a high weapon on these two is actually much more important. Two-handers are going to be basically stat sticks, right? And the only stat that really matters on this one, I mean, the physical damage is nice, but the big one is Deathblow creates a shockwave dealing up to 38% of its base damage to enemies. Enemies who die to this effect, this is the key part, also resets Deathblow's cooldowns. Any way to minimize the downtime of Deathblow, you're going to be happy. This turns it into an AoE, and it resets the cooldown. Like, it's just such quality of life that you do not want to give up. That's basically it. And the final one is pretty important as well. Like I said when we were going over our skill tree, you do want a bludgeoning weapon to take advantage of the 15% increased damage using a bludgeoning weapon while they're vulnerable and stunned. You just need one to make that effect happen. I have Edgebuster, so when you have full fury, you get 20% more damage. Finally, the stats on this weapon, it's pretty much the same. You just want the vulnerability, number 1, crit, number 2, and then strength and close interchangeable. And instead of strength, you can also get all stats instead of strength if you need more stats to take advantage of your Paragon tree. So that kind of covers our items. Let's just go over our expertise. Expertise, I would probably recommend the 15 times more damage to vulnerable enemies, right? Because we are a one-hand version, we actually get to take advantage of both the sword and the one-hand mace. So 10% increased damage to stun enemies, double this amount when using 2 maces. We're only using 1, so that's only 10%. But 10% times damage is actually still pretty nice. Your sword, lucky hit, you basically just get more fury. Quality of life stuff doesn't really matter. Killing crowd-controlled enemy grants you attack speed, which also not a huge deal, but mainly you want the mace thing for 10% more damage. And if you are somewhat new, just to quickly go over expertise, and if you're a veteran, feel free to just skip on right ahead to the next section. The way expertise work is whatever you have selected, you gain that bonus, right? No matter what. So it doesn't matter what weapon you're using, you're always getting that bonus. However, you are only getting the top line of that bonus, right? So you are only getting the 15% increased damage to vulnerable. You are not getting the 10% increased critical strike chance against vulnerable. And then everything else is basically just like you get the bonuses, the both line, the top and bottom, as long as you're using it. So for example, this one, you're using slashing. So every time you hit things with that, you get the slashing bonus, right? You inflict some additional bleeds. And then we went over why we're one-handing macing, right? Because we are getting both benefits. So that kind of covers the expertise. And finally, we're going to summarize the video with the Paragon board. So the Paragon board, you get life and armor. Armor is super important, right? And then you get life and physical damage. Pretty good to have, just for a few points to start. First one I have here, the order actually, when you're leveling, I would swap Territorial for Exploit. Exploit is the one that gives you every 20 seconds or something, you always hit things vulnerable. For every dex around it, you actually get vulnerability damage, right? But Territorial is nice because you do every 5 point of dex, you just do more damage to close enemies, and you're a barbarian, you're going to be up in their face. And then you also get 10% damage reduction against close enemies. So tankiness and damage, so pretty good. Physical damage and strength, sure, and then armor and strength. Basically, I pathed up this way. To be efficient with your Paragon, you want to avoid dead stats. By dead stats, the main one that you want to avoid is basically intelligence. Intelligence is not really needed for Barbarian, not because we're dumb, but because our Paragon tree, most of the yellow rare nodes require either dexterity, willpower, or strength, right? Never intelligence. At least I haven't seen a single one. That's what I would consider a dead stat. It increases your resistance, which currently pretty much the most useless stat in the game right now. It's definitely good to avoid intelligence on your Paragon tree. So that's kind of what you want to do to min-max your routing, right? So I went this way just to dodge that. So next up, we take Flawless Technique. You get 30% more critical strike damage, right? That's pretty good. And 10% more physical damage on that node. So you just grab those and you get a ton more, another 7.5 crit damage, another 7.5 here, physical damage, which is whatever, but another 7.5 here. So you can see how much crit damage is in that little area. Next up, you want heavy blows, 30% critical strike damage with one-handed weapons. Or one-handed, another 30 there, right? That's pretty good. Here we have 16.9 critical strike damage with one-handed weapons, right? Another 16.9. Another 16.9. So you can see how that kind of adds up together. The reason why it's so high is because we have a glyph here. Grants 125% bonus to all magic nodes within range. That's pretty nuts, right? Like more than double on your blue nodes. Now, what do we have here for blue nodes? The bottom was the crazy offensive, but the top part, it's not bad either. 5% damage reduction from close, another 5 here, and another 5 here, right? You're getting 15% more damage reduction, and then you get 9 from here through the rare node. So that's a ton of defense, that's a ton of offense. You go ahead, fill that up. You want 40 strength, so you want to grab some strength around to make sure that works. Good thing is these rare nodes give you 10 strength each, right? So you're basically covered halfway through that, 20 out of 40. So after that, we kind of take a quick route to get out of there as fast as possible, and we go into our next board. Our next board is Warbringer. For every 75 fury you spend, you gain 12% of your maximum life as fortified. Like I said, the way you survive as Barb is being fortified. When you spam your upheaval, right, fury costs 40, spend 45, 2 upheavals, bam bam, you're getting some fortify. So yeah, that's kind of why we grab that for survivability, but also on this board you'll see what synergizes with our unique weapon, which is kind of where all the huge damage comes from, is maximum fury. Just grab basically fury nodes because fury equals damage. When you're pathing through here, there's even more fury. 16 here, 4 here, 4 here, and another 4 here. Now, when you're going through here, you can get raw power, which is just 20% more physical damage. Yeah, next up, we have Mortal Draw. Weapons with skills that swap to new weapons. So this is great. Because we are a walking arsenal build using 3 different weapons, every time we swap, unless we like go left click, every time we swap, you're dealing 61% more damage with that skill, which is pretty good. But the great thing about that is every time you swap weapons, you get 18% chance for that skill to crit. That's pretty nice. So our crit chance is actually only 35.4 right now. I'm missing 6% here. So you can get close to, 40% crit is probably when you're maxed out. And then that glyph, though, gives you 18 on its own. I believe it's separate. Your numbers are big, right? Big numbers are good. Okay, so after that, you kind of just path through to get to exit out to get to the next board as quick as possible. The board is Decimator. Decimator gives you vulnerable damage. And we all know how crazy vulnerable damage is. So this gives you 20% here, and then some damage reduction from vulnerable enemies. Hey, they're almost always vulnerable because of our skill tree. So that's pretty good, 8%, right? You get another 10% here, a 10% here, 10% here. You're getting 30 plus 20. This little area, I believe, gives you 50% more vulnerable damage, right? This board is also crazy. While you're doing that, you're going to put a glyph here, and we have ambidextrous. You deal 8% times more damage while wielding one-handed weapons, right? Because we are one hand, and grants 100% bonus to all magic nodes within range. So this is the one I actually have been leveling. As you can see, it's level 16 out of the maximum level 21. And if I assume correctly, because it's very similar to what Marshall does, grants 125% bonus to magic nodes, it should go from 100% to 125%. These vulnerable nodes used to be just 5% vulnerable damage, right? So now they're 10 because of this glyph. And then I think you can also get some damage reduction here. So this would be 4% damage reduction. Honestly, that's kind of juicy. Another 4% there. So I might try to figure out how to get those 4 points to be a bit tankier, right? So after that, again, you're going to try to just get out of this tree as quickly as possible. But before you do that, you might as well grab Pillage, because that's another 20% vulnerable damage and 100 armor. That's pretty good. So after that, you want to go into Bludgeoner, right? You're going to get some damage reduction while healthy, as well as over here, you're just going to get more armor, as well as over here, 20% damage while fortified, and then also while you're healthy. Good defense, good offense, synergizes, and then you get another 8-point damage reduction while fortified here. This area here for defense, if you're leveling, I would probably just do this last and instead get through the glyph nodes to go here so that you get your last glyph, because glyphs are crazy. And then once you have that, you can start probably picking up these extra defenses and also the extra damage as well, right? So this is kind of where I would swap the place of exploit for territorial. It's just a nice thing to have while you're leveling, and then you can put territorial here instead where I have it. And then next up is finally your last board. You're pretty much out of points by then, but as you can see, it's just enough to get the extra bonus. And what do we have here? We have Undaunted. So while you're fortified, which is quite constantly, you're getting 42.8% more damage, right? That's great. And then you get also 10% damage reduction for meeting the requirement. And then in the final nodes here, we only have 10% physical damage and 10 strength, which is honestly not that bad. As you can see, you get another 10% physical damage. I'm okay to give up, right? Because what we gained was critical damage and vulnerable damage and a bunch of other stuff just to lose 10% physical damage. And the other one is 100 armor. Now, it would be nice to have that and make me a little bit tankier. And it depends. Like if you are pushing, maybe every node of armor counts. And honestly, that might be the case if you're trying to do like Nightmare 100. But I figured if we're doing a speed farming build, 100 armor, right? When you have 1,000 armor on a piece here, in my opinion, it wasn't that valuable, but I understand in Nightmare 100, almost every bit of defense counts. So, but yeah, for speed farming, I gave that up and we went over the glyph, and that pretty much kind of summarizes what the Paragon for this one-hand Deathblow build is. Other than avoiding intelligence, one little tip that I would say for new players, pay attention to these rare nodes. How come this is the order I chose? There might be a better route, to be honest, but I tried to min-max it as best as possible here. But as you can see, this rare node, guess what? It only costs 160 dex. This one, 160 willpower. It is your first board, and this one costs strength. You have 1,000 strength. Strength isn't really anything you're going to be worried about, but you are definitely going to be worried about dex and willpowers. Now, as you progress, the requirement for these yellow nodes are going to slowly increase, and they increase actually quite substantially by the time you get to the very last board. Now you need 610 dex and 610 willpower. As you can see, this is kind of why I mentioned earlier on when we were going through our items, how important all stats are on certain pieces of gear like your weapon, because that allows me to basically exactly get enough dexterity here, 531 out of 520, and 556 out of 530 willpower to get these bonuses, right? It just kind of free bonuses to get. Technically not free because you're sacrificing probably a little bit of strength to get dex and willpower on your weapon, but I think in the end the trade-off is a net positive, right? So if I could, I would try to get 610 dex, but at this point it is something that you might want to, the math genius out there can try to figure out, is it worth sacrificing some other stats on your item just to get, what do we need, like 80 dexterity there, right? That's a lot. And because our weapon is overkill and it doesn't roll all stats, I would say it's almost impossible. Unless you start taking out stats from other pieces of gear that are super important just to get all stats. In that case, no longer worth it, right? So that's kind of where I've landed with this build. Feel free to give it a go. It is quite satisfying, and I can clear tier 60s perfectly fine. And if you do want to push for Nightmare Dungeons, one thing that's easy to do is swapping out some aspects for more defensive aspects. You can put your Disobedience here, the 45% more armor, or 50 when it's maxed, on your amulet. Because now, instead of 45, you get 75% more armor when it's maxed out, right? Yeah, if you guys figure out any clever ways to improve upon this build, please post in the comments and let me know. That'd be much appreciated. That's pretty much it for this build. Hopefully I didn't forget anything. I will be posting the written guide in the description for you guys to see. Hope you enjoyed the build guide. And let me know in the comments what you guys want to see next. Maybe we do a Leap Quake build or something else. If you've stuck to the video for this long, honestly, thank you so much. And yeah, I'll see you guys next time.